We had talked about connections between ancient Israel and Judah from a royal perspective, right, on kind of that top societal level. And then last week, really looking at Judah and how Judah still continued to function after the exile, and really looking at sources that give us a view into the everyday life. And so this week, what we're going to be doing is we're gonna be looking at kind of what, right, these hundreds, if not thousands of years of interaction between, on the one hand, Israel and Judah, and on the other hand, Assyria and Babylonia, kind of these large Mesopotamian cultures. So what those thousands of years of interaction did, right? What, from a cultural perspective, what kind of residue did they leave on the biblical text as we know it? What kind of residue did they leave on the Talmudic text, right? Obviously a text that, at least on one hand, is composed in Babylon, right? So we're going to be really looking at that today, diving into that. And so I have posted a link to the Google Doc in the chat, and I will share my screen for everybody. So we'll have a version on the screen here. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So we're gonna begin in the beginning, a parsha that we read a few weeks ago at this point, but we're gonna start with creation. We're gonna start with kind of the first creation story in Genesis 1 and then beginning of Genesis 2. So who would like to read sources 1 and 2?
I can read.
Sure.
Okay. When God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep and a wind from God sweeping over the water, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, a first day. God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the water, that it may separate water from water." God made the expanse, and it separated the water which was below the expanse from the water which was above the expanse, and it was so. The heaven and the earth were finished in all their array. On the seventh day, God finished the work that he had been doing, and he ceased on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because on it God ceased from all the work of creation that he had done.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Right. So this is obviously a story that everyone is, I would think, very familiar with here, but let's just kind of go over a little bit, right? And get at some key points that are going to be interesting for us as we look at source 3. So what are the preconditions of creation here? Right? What is there before creation begins?
God.
Good, right? So very clearly we have God in the picture. What else?
An emptiness.
Okay, right? Some sort of emptiness or void. Perfect. What else?
Darkness.
Good, right? So darkness is there, right? This is one that most people don't necessarily kind of look at originally. What else is there?
Water.
Water. Good, right? So the surface of the deep, right, in this, and the Hebrew, right, al pnei tehom. Okay, so tehom, right, is this poetic word for the depths of the ocean or the water. Absolutely. Good. Okay, so that's kind of what we have for the precondition. And then how is creation done in this, very famously, right, in this account? How does creation take place?
A wind from God.
Okay, right. On the one hand, we have kind of, right, a manifestation of God, okay, doing some sort of action here, right, sweeping over the water. How else?
Done verbally.
Yeah.
Good, right? So very famously, God said, "Let there be light," right? Yehi or. So God commanding things to happen. Great. So it's done verbally. How else?
How about through evolution?
Right. So from our perspective, we would look at it potentially through evolution. How do you see evolution in the text itself?
It goes from light to dark, from fish to, to mammals to humans.
Okay, right. That you go from kind of lesser beings to higher order beings. For sure, you definitely do see that in the text in terms of day 4, 4, 5, and 6. What about here? We have God kind of speaking and creation happening, but how else does God create here?
Well, it says in verse 7, God made the expanse.
Great.
Now, the other says God called or God spoke. What
Perfect.
do you mean by made the expanse?
It's a great question, right? And
And
this is something
I would add to that the idea of separation.
Mhm.
That it's not, there seems to be some substance because God's already separating.
Yes, 100%, right? So we have not only speaking, we have making, whatever that means in terms of a divine sense, but as Norman very well pointed out, we also have separation, right? We have separating, especially in the first day, right? Separating light from darkness, right? Let there be light. God separated the light from the darkness, obviously, right? As well as on the second day. And then we'll see this in later days as well. So we have creation through speech, we have separation, and then we have creation through right, making, whatever that might mean. Good. Okay. And the main actor, right? I know we've already kind of covered this, but the main actor in this text is whom?
God.
God. Good. Okay. Right. God is kind of the main actor. Obviously, on day 6, there's a bit of the commentators have a field day with it, right? Na'aseh Adam b'tzalmenu, let us make man in our image, and we can, debate kind of what that means or talk about what that means in another class, because I think that's a whole other class. But yeah, God is right the center of what's going on here, absolutely. And then just kind of switching over to source 2 for a little bit. What's the focus? So we talked about kind of the main actor being God, but what's really the crescendo? What's the climax of the creation story from a Jewish perspective?
Creation of man.
Okay, so on the one hand, you could say creation of man. Okay.
And the Shabbat.
And the Shabbat. Good. Okay, so what's really interesting is when we look at it from a chapter by chapter perspective, chapter 1 ends with the creation of man, right? The last creative act is the creation of man. It gets the most stage time, if you will, right? The chapters, just so that everyone here knows a little bit of a history lesson, the chapters were added by Christian biblical scholars, right? The church, and were only adopted by Jews when they had to dispute with Christians, right? Kind of these medieval disputations between Christian and Jews, so that Jews would then know what chapter and verse Christians were talking about, right? Traditionally, in terms of the Torah, Jews divided it, right, by Parsha, which we still do today, and then by specific divisions within the Masoretic text itself, right? So obviously this pei here in parentheses, right, tells us that this is a division. We also have a samech sometimes, right? But so what's interesting is the chapter from a chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3 perspective. Chapter 1 ends with the creation of man. And so from the Christian point of view, the climax is the creation of man. From a Jewish point of view, the last creative act is the creation of man. And obviously that's extremely important. But from a Jewish point of view, I would argue that the climax is really Shabbat, right? So it's after the creation itself and kind of what this all means, right? And God kind of resting and sanctifying the Shabbat. Okay, so let's pause there. Any questions, sources 1 and 2, before we move on to some of the Babylonian sources here? Okay, so let's move on to source 3, just to give everyone a little bit of a background. Source 3 is in Akkadian is called Enuma Elish, which translates, it's based on the first words, right, of the text, which in Akkadian are kind of when above or when on high, right? That should be familiar. Just like we don't call the first book Genesis, we call the first book of the Torah Breshit, right? Based on that first word. In Akkadian, the naming practices are the same, where texts are named after kind of the first word or first few words. This is very often described, this text that we're going to read kind of excerpts from, very often described as the Babylonian epic of creation. And while it does contain an idea, one of the Babylonian ideas of how the earth or the world was created, it does a lot more than that, right? It's a poem, an epic poem that kind of describes and elevates the god Marduk. Marduk is the chief god in the Babylonian pantheon. And so it describes how Marduk was elevated to the head of the pantheon. But within doing so, it also recounts kind of a creation idea. So who wants to start reading this? Just to give us an idea, this first section before the first ellipsis is from the beginning of the text, so the first 9 lines of the text. And then after that, the next 3 sections are all from tablet 4, so later on in the text. And I'll fill in some of the gap for you. But who wants to read source 3 for us here? Yeah.
When the skies above were not yet named, nor earth below pronounced by name, Apsu, the first one, their begetter, and the maker Tiamat, who bore them all, had mixed either waters together, but had not formed pastures, nor could reed beds be found, when yet no gods were manifest, nor names pronounced, nor destinies decreed, then gods were born within them.
Perfect.
O Marduk, you are honored among the great gods. Your destiny is unequaled. Your word has the power of Anu. From this day onward, your command shall not be altered. Yours is the power to exalt and abase. May your utterance be law and your word never be falsified.
Good. And then would you like to read kind of the last 2 sections here as well?
And they set up in their midst one constellation. And then they addressed Marduk, their son. May your decree, O Lord, impress the gods. Command to destroy and to recreate, and let it be so. Speak and let the constellation vanish. Speak it again and let the constellation reappear. He spoke, and at his word the constellation vanished. He spoke it again, and the constellation was recreated. When the gods, his fathers, saw how effective his utterance was, they rejoiced and proclaimed Marduk is king.
Great.
The Lord rested and inspected her, Tiamat's corpse. He divided the monstrous shape and created marbles. He sliced her in half like a fish for drying. Half of her he put up to roof the sky, drew a bolt across and made a guard hold it. Her waters he arranged so that they could not escape.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Okay, so as I said before, this first section here is from the beginning of the epic. These kind of clips from tablet 4, basically what happens between the beginning in tablet 1 and tablet 4 is that Tiamat and Apsu, who are kind of these primeval figures who we're going to talk about, they create the rest of the gods, and then kind of the gods create generations upon generations of gods. And basically what happens is the gods get very loud, and Tiamat doesn't like that. So Tiamat and kind of her troop basically start to talk about killing the gods, right, and doing away with the gods. The gods hear about this, kind of this Marduk and 1 generation older than him, hear about this and are really disturbed by what's going on. They try to stop the plans from happening. They only kind of succeed, but just makes Tiamat kind of more angry. And so the gods don't really know what to do. There's no one among them who is strong enough to take on Tiamat. And so what they do is, after kind of some back and forth, they ask Marduk if he will kind of confront Tiamat. He agrees. And this scene that we see here, the "O Marduk, you're honored among the great gods," this is kind of when the gods and Marduk get together after Marduk agrees to take on the challenge, and they make sure that he's up to the task. They then kind of test his powers. We're going to talk about that. And then this last little bit comes after Marduk and Tiamat engage in battle. Marduk defeats Tiamat, and then we see kind of what happens right after the defeat. Okay. Good. So in the Enuma Elish, let's go over some of the similar questions. What are the preconditions to creation here? What do we get in the beginning? What is there and what is not there?
The sky was there and the earth below, but they were not named.
Good. Okay. And this is an interesting and important point. Naming in Mesopotamia, in ancient Iraq, just like in ancient Israel, it had a very special quality to it, right? To name something meant to bring something into existence almost, right? And so this idea that the skies or the heavens and the earth were there but weren't named, we're not totally clear on what that means. It could mean that they had not yet been created, or it could mean that kind of they existed in some primordial form, but had not yet kind of been created in the way that we knew it. Okay, good. What else?
Well, the phrase when yet no gods were manifest, that there were no gods present.
Good. Okay, right. So this kind of earliest point before the creation, unlike in Genesis 1, there's no God, right, as we know it, or there are no gods. That being said, it's not to say that it is actorless, right? Who are the actors who are present?
And Tiamat and Marduk.
Right, so we have Tiamat, okay, the maker Tiamat who bore them all, and then who else?
Apsu.
Apsu, good, right? So we have Apsu and Tiamat. Apsu, just so this is a fun English lesson for anybody here. Apsu is actually where we get the English word for abyss, okay? Abyss, kind of, right, a deep area of water. Apsu is kind of the god of this kind of primordial, almost Titan-like figure of the deep, right? Kind of the deep water. And so he's this male figure, and then Tiamat is this female figure connected to the ocean and the waters, okay? The salt water. Good. So Apsu and Tiamat are already there. Does this ring a bell, right? Does this kind of, if we're reading source 3 after 1 and 2, how may we connect source 3 to 1 and 2 just on what we read here in this first stanza?
Is it an Adam and Eve figure, or is it just mirroring somewhat the creation of Bereshit?
Right. So it's a good question, right? We don't have humans here necessarily. So what I think is interesting from this perspective, similar to the beginning of Bereshit, right before creation, it's not like there is nothing, right? There is kind of this salt water. There is this darkness that in the creation story. Here we're talking about, right, kind of Tiamat and Apsu, who represent, like we said, maybe fresh water, salt water. There is kind of a nothingness, right? When skies above were not named, nor earth below pronounced by name, no pastures have been formed, no reed-beds could be found. So kind of the description through what there is not, right? And then the thing that I think is very interesting, if we look at the beginning in verse 2, Genesis 1-2, right? Okay, so tehom as this word for the deep, okay? Tehom is a cognate of Tiamat, okay? So the at ending is the feminine ending in Akkadian, just like it's, right, the taf kind of at the end of a word will often mark its as a feminine word in Hebrew. So if we take that part off there, right, that feminine ending, instead of Tiamat, we get Tiam, which, right, we can see there's no kind of clear H sound in Akkadian. We have a chet sound, but we don't have kind of a hey sound. And so what happens is tehom in Hebrew, if you were to say that in Akkadian, would be tiam or tiamat, okay? So in both cases, we have this tehom tiamat there existing, okay? Obviously in the Genesis account, it's just kind of a part of the background. Obviously in Enuma Elish, it becomes a much bigger deal, okay? Good.
One observation in the Babylonian story, creation is considered like giving birth. In our tradition, it's not. It's just a command, and it's creating something like light didn't exist. God just commanded that be there, and it was there. And
absolutely, right? Yes, 100%. In the Babylonian tradition that we see here, that is totally correct. That the idea of creation, it's, I think, right, not necessarily as scientifically put, but it's messier, right? That we're talking about birth, we're talking about kind of the mixing of waters and birthing gods, and then we're talking about this primeval war that occurs, and then through that war, creation happens, right? Whereas in the text from Genesis, we have God speaking, maybe God doing some other actions, but there aren't any other real actors in that text, right? And it's more clean and clear cut. Absolutely. Okay, what about, so obviously we talked about kind of Tiamat and Apsu being there before creation. The main actor of this text, right, we kind of gave it away in talking about it, but it's right, it's Marduk. Marduk is the main actor here, even though we do have a lot of other gods that do many other things. What about in these texts, right, that we just read, how does Marduk create?
He speaks.
Good. Okay, so at least in some of these verses that we read, Marduk's speech or utterance has a power to it, right? So from this day onward, your command shall not be altered. Yours is the power to exalt and abase. May your utterance be law, your word never be falsified, right? So this power of speech. And then we see that power put into action when he kind of tests it, and he can both destroy and create and then recreate a constellation, okay? Kind of, right, these stars within the heavens itself. And then right as the gods see that, they then realize, hey, this guy's for real, right? And they declare him as king. Great. How else?
He cut up Tiamat.
Good, right? So he cuts up Tiamat. Tiamat is, right, as kind of this personification, if you will, of salt water, depths, things like that. She is probably considered a fish or something, right? Some sort of sea creature, right? And so we have her after he kills Tiamat. He then cuts her in half, sliced her in half like a fish for drying, okay? And then what does he do with her halves?
He separates, just as in our tradition, God
Great.
separates.
Absolutely, right? So Marduk separates Tiamat and puts half of her up to roof the sky, and then kind of draws this bolt across to separate the upper from the lower, right? And so if we look back in the text from Genesis, right, we have in God creating in the second day the sky, the Shemayim, and then the Mayim below. What does he put in to separate there?
Land.
Sorry?
Well, it's land, but it expands in the middle, which is land.
Good, right? So this kind of rakia, which we will know that it will be land later on, but rakia is kind of it's a hard term, right? It means probably something hammered out, because we know that verb means like something to hammer out, like in a metallurgy fashion. And so, maybe some sort of dome, right? Like a hammered dome or something to keep the waters up in the sky and to keep the sky where it is. Just like we have Marduk, right, kind of drawing a bolt between, right, kind of a massive world-sized bolt between the oceans below and the heavens above. Okay, good. Great. All right. So when looking at the two creation stories, I think it's important, like a lot of people often focus on the differences, and it's important to focus on the differences. It's important, I think, to note both, right? That in both, we do have God's creating through speech. In both, we have kind of these primeval elements existing beforehand, right? In one, darkness and kind of salt water, and the other, salt water and fresh water. The Babylonian version is obviously more messy, right? Even though in the Tanakh we have God creating through his own actions and not just through speech. In the Babylonian version, right, the vast majority of Marduk's creation is done. This is just kind of a little bit that I've given you. The vast majority of Marduk's creation is kind of repurposing Tiamat and taking different parts of her and making mountains out of her, and right, setting up temples for the gods out of parts of her and those kinds of things. And so, right, kind of reusing kind of, right, this defeated enemy. And so there are lots of differences, but there are also interesting similarities and hints, right? A lot of people who have noted these connections between Enuma Elish on the one hand and the creation story in Breshit on the other we'll kind of note this use of Tehom in verse 2 and kind of see that as a nod by the biblical writer as kind of a, listen, what we're doing here is not a Babylonian creation story, right? The Tehom, the Tiamat here plays no role in the creation, right? But we acknowledge that we acknowledge that there is another story and that this is not the only way to tell a creation story, right? So you can kind of understand it how you will, but many people will say that this text is written from a source that probably originated somewhere around the Babylonian exile, the priestly source. And so they would have had knowledge of kind of these Babylonian ideas, even if they couldn't have read the text of Enuma Elish itself, right? Good. Okay, any questions about sources 1, 2, and 3 here?
I
Yes.
don't, oh, Rabbi, I don't have a question, but Marduk, I remember Marduk in the Purim story, or Mordechai, wasn't there Marduk? There's a
Absolutely.
connection. What's the story?
Yes,
Marduk?
it's a great question. So in the Purim story, we have Mordechai and Esther, okay? Mordechai and Esther. Mordechai's name doesn't really have a good Hebrew etymology. Esther has a Hebrew etymology connected to hidden, potentially. That being said, it's pretty clear that the two names are Marduk, right, who we know here is kind of the head of the Babylonian pantheon,
Right.
and Ishtar. So Ishtar, who by that time her name was probably pronounced something like Isar or Istar, and so Esther, is kind of the most important feminine god in the Babylonian pantheon.
Okay.
And so what I would say, and I think what some people have said, is that the Purim story, right, just like the holiday of Purim, it is there are many farcical elements there. And so naming the two main Jewish heroes after the heads of the Babylonian pantheon, right, is kind of this farce and this kind of right, nahafochu, everything is kind of put on its head.
Okay.
That's what I would say. But there are many other answers out there.
Yeah.
Zach, so which came first, the chicken or the egg on this one?
Exactly.
Which came first? Good question. So the Enuma Elish, right, the source that we're reading here, as I said, people have said late 2nd to early 1st millennium BCE. The first written copy that we have is, I think, somewhere around 700, 750 BCE. It's almost certainly earlier than that. I would say that Enuma Elish was written beforehand. That being said, the version that we have here in Breshit, at the beginning of Breshit, even if it was written later, like I said, it also, I would not say that any of the similarities are kind of close enough that it would require the person who, or the people, or what have you, who wrote, right, Breshit, who wrote this story in Breshit, had the Babylonian text in front of them, right? They don't have to read Enuma Elish. They don't have to know any of that. What they have to do is they have to be situated in a culture where Enuma Elish is a known story, right? Or at least the story behind Enuma Elish. This idea of Tiamat existing beforehand, and then Marduk kind of besting Tiamat, killing her, and then turning her into creation, right? And so knowing those ideas, or having those ideas kind of float around, I think are helpful when looking at the creation story. The way that I often think about some of these is kind of like how somebody in maybe modern day Yemen, or I don't know, South Korea, something like that, how much they might know of different American ideas, right? Maybe even a closer analog. If we're talking about England, or right, someone from England or someone from Canada, how much do they know about George Washington and kind of the idea of the founding fathers? They probably have an idea, right, that George Washington was an important figure, maybe, right? And they may know some other ideas, but they don't have kind of, right, the depth of mythological knowledge that we do as Americans. Or that kind of the people who really study this do as Americans. Because I think if you ask most Americans, they only have kind of slivers of this mythological knowledge themselves. Babylonia and Assyria, right, modern day Iraq, these cultures in modern day Iraq, as the dominant cultures of the time, I think it's pretty clear that the peoples who lived around them, whether they lived in the same area or not, and obviously we know, right, that Judeans lived in Babylonia itself, that they had some sort of familiarity with the broad strokes of some ideas in Babylonia and Assyria. So there are definitely some of those similarities, and I think this is the similarities between Enuma Elish and Breshit, the creation story in Breshit, are a good example of that, right? Maybe broad strokes. We're not talking about big borrowings from one or the other or anything like that, but interesting to look at, right? One in contrast to the other and in comparison. And a couple of the other sources we're going to look at, I think there maybe is a case for closer connections potentially. So before we move on, any other questions here? Okay, cool. So let's read, who wants to read source 4 for me?
I will.
Sure.
Thus said the Lord, do not learn to go the way of the nations, and do not dismayed by portents in the sky. Let the nations be dismayed by them. For the laws of the nations are delusions, for it is the work of a craftsman's hands. He cuts down a tree in the forest with an axe. He adorns it with silver and gold. He fastens it with nails and hammers, so that it does not totter. They are like a scarecrow in a cucumber patch. They cannot speak. They have to be carried, for they cannot walk. Be not afraid of them, for they can do no harm, nor is it in them to do any good. O Lord, there is none like you. You are great, and your name is great in power.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. How would you write kind of what's the 1 minute summary of this passage from Yirmiyahu, from Jeremiah?
Don't listen to idols and don't listen to soothsayers.
Good, right? So don't listen to kind of these soothsayers or people that are predicting the future from these other nations, and don't listen to idols. Why shouldn't we listen to idols?
It's from the Atzabeim Kesev Zahav Maaseh Yedei Adam.
Absolutely, right? Come on, like we shouldn't listen to these because these are things made by people, right? They're not the God who, right? The God who we're talking about here. This is a God who is incorporeal, right? There's no connection to kind of humans creating him, right? He exists throughout, what have you. That being said, right? This is it's a kind of a nice contrastive picture of what we would consider idols, right? These are cult statues that are made by humans and kind of, right, are addressed pretty pejoratively in Jeremiah, right? Jeremiah is saying, come on, these are like scarecrows, right? People made them, people set them up, they can't walk, they can't talk, people have to carry them, right? So they can't do anything.
It's the famous Abraham story when his father comes back to the store.
Absolutely.
Says, what happened to my idols? He said, this one destroyed all the other ones. He says, that's impossible, and etc.
Absolutely, right? And we're going to see, so we're going to read one more text, and this is, right, kind of Atzabehem Kesef Zahav, right? This is the text that everyone really knows that drives this point home. And then we're going to look at kind of that uncomfortability within the Akkadian spirit itself, because the people who actually, believe that their gods were manifest through these cult statues, they knew that they were created by humans also. And there was some uncomfortableness with that, right? And so how do they get past that? Good, but first let's read Psalm 115, the beginning of 115. Lolan.
Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name, bring glory for the sake of your love and your faithfulness. Let the nations not say, where now is their God? When our God is in heaven and all that he wills, he accomplishes. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths, but cannot speak, eyes, but cannot see. They have ears, but cannot hear, noses, but cannot smell. They have hands, but cannot touch, feet, but cannot walk. They can make no sound in their throats. Those who fashion them, all who trust in them, shall become like them.
Perfect. Great. All right. So what's kind of the twist here of this text?
That if you worship the idols, that you will become like them.
Good, right? Just as they are fully ineffectual, right? They can't speak, they can't see, they can't smell, they can't eat, they can't feel, they can't walk, right? If you worship them, you will become as senseless and as kind of detached from reality as they are. Good, good. Okay, so now we're going to look at kind of this great Mesopotamian source called the mouth opening ritual, Mispi ritual. We're going to look at a few different verses from parts of the third tablet of the mouth opening ritual. And basically, just so to give everyone a little bit of background here, the mouth opening ritual is the ritual that was done on cultic statues after they had been kind of created in the craftsman shop. How do you go from a cultic statue made with a wooden core and then with gold or silver outsides and things like that? How do you go from something like that made clearly by human hands to a statue that gets worshipped as, if not a god, a manifestation of a god, right? How do you make that jump? So let's see. Who wants to read some of these sources here?
Iya,
Good.
Shamash, and Asalahu, who
Yeah,
judged
that's a rough one. I apologize. These names, and they're only going to get worse in this part. But we can skip over the names. It's not a big deal.
who judge the heavens and the earth, who determine the destinies, who fix decisions, who make sanctuaries great. Because the completion of the rites of the great gods and the direction of the plan of the purification rite rest with you. On this day be present. For this statue that stands before you, ceremoniously grant him the destiny that his mouth may eat, that his ears may hear. May the God become pure like heaven, clean like the earth, bright like the center of heaven. May the evil tongues stand aside. This statue that Ninkora, Ninagal, Kusabanda, Ninildu, and Ninsadim have made. This statue cannot smell incense without the opening of the mouth ritual. It can neither eat food nor drink water. Bring out this statue before Shamash. Return to their places the adze that was driven into the wood, the chisel that carved it, the saw that cut it, along with the master craftsman who prepared it. Bind their hands with a scarf. Cut off the fists of the stoneworkers who touched him with a tamarisk knife. This is the statue that Ninkora, Ninagal, Kusabanda, Ninildu, and Ninzadim made. Kusu, the chief purification priest of Enlil, has purified it with a holy water basin, censer, and torch with his pure hands. Asalahu, the son of Iridu, made it resplendent. The Apkalu and the Abriku priest of Iridu have opened your mouth twice, 7 times with syrup, ghee, cedar, and cypress. May this God become pure like heaven, clean like the earth, bright like the center of heaven. May the evil tongue stand aside.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Right, as I said, the divine names in Akkadian are very often rough, and then here we also kind of have a group of gods, right? This first group, Ea, Shamash, and Asaluki. Ea is kind of the god of wisdom. Shamash is the sun god, who is
Shemesh.
Right, exactly, 100%, right? Like Shemesh, so that's the cognate there. Also, because he's the sun god, he is the god of justice and truth, because right, the sun kind of shines over everything, and so right, the ability to kind of dispense truth and justice, that kind of thing. And then Asaluchi is a very early name for Marduk, probably another god at first, who then kind of came together with Marduk. So in this case, the aspect of Marduk is kind of Marduk as the god of kind of ritual and magic. All right, for lack of a more explanation here. So these 3 gods, right, they judge heaven and earth, determine the destinies. They are kind of very important in the beginning of these rites, because the completion of the rites of the great gods, direction of the planet, the purification rites rest with you, right? Because all of these things basically are from you 3 really important gods. You should be present here, right? And then what should they be present for? What's kind of the crux of this mouth opening ritual? What's the goal?
Allow the God to hear and to speak and to respond, to be a God, not just an idol.
Perfect, right? Grant him the destiny that his mouth may eat, that his ears may hear, pure like the heaven, right? And this is kind of a refrain that we see later on. Then we have kind of, right, this statue that these lesser kind of craftsman gods had made. The statue cannot smell incense without this opening of the mouth ritual. It can neither eat food nor drink water. Okay. So this, right, this should ring a bell for anyone here, right, who just read the last two sources that we saw in Psalms and Jeremiah. We're going to get into that together. But first, before we do, what is this, right? I preface this text by saying that it addresses some of the hesitancies and potential problems that the Babylonians and Assyrians saw with creating an image of a god out of earthly materials, right? How does it potentially address some of those issues? What are some of the ways that it goes about kind of saying, all right, we know that we've created, right, a manifestation of a god out of wood and gold and things like that, but we're turning it into something else. How does it do that?
With this ceremony.
Good, right? So the first, absolutely, right? The first answer with this ceremony, with this kind of mouth opening ceremony with ritual, right? And then looking at this part of the ritual that we talked about, specifically, maybe this paragraph here and then this last paragraph here. What are some different ways that it gets around that?
So they dip
Water.
in holy water, right?
Right. Okay, right. So you have kind of holy water, you have a basin, you have a censer, right? You have all these kind of purification.
You have
it
a
has
priest. You
Fire.
have a priest. The priest
Good.
sanctifies it.
Right, absolutely. You have the priest coming in and sanctifying it, right? You have kind of the use of fire potentially, absolutely. Right, in the sanctification, opening of your mouth, right, twice 7 times, so 14 times, with syrup, ghee, cedar, and cypress, right? Kind of these different materials. Great. What about this part up here? Because
Right.
this is one of my favorite bits. What's
You
going
don't
on?
have many experienced craftsmen. They do it once and they're out of work.
That's the
Absolutely,
stonework.
right? You know, and if we take this text at face value, then it seems like you don't want to be an experienced craftsman because, right, just as Norman said, you do it once, you're out of work. What I think the text is getting at, because I agree, right? If we just take it at face value, that's what we get. But tamarisk, right? Tamarisk, that's a rough one. Tamarisk being a type of tree, I think what's happening here is that we have kind of a ritualized cutting off of the hands, right? Where even though the text does not say you're not really going to cut off his hands, but just kind of play at it, right? I think it's you take this wooden knife, and instead of us trying to think that you're trying to cut off someone's hand with a wooden knife, it's a view of this person who is most closely connected to this cultic statue is right. He is out of the picture now. We're cutting off his hands, right? Because he never did it. This is not his creation. And these tools that he used, these aren't in the picture either, right? These are kind of returned to their places. These are kind of brought, out of the spotlight, right? The person who does it, his hands are cut off. And so these are not the people who made this statue. Who made the statue?
Marduk.
Okay, right, on one hand, Marduk, but right here, the next line in the text, the next line in the text, right after we say that kind of the human craftsman and his tools, right, who didn't make this is the statue that Ninkura, Ninagal, Kusibanda, Ninildu, and Nizadi made, right? These different kind of minor craftsman deities, right? This is like a halach ma'anya, right? You're showing, right, this is the statue that they made. And so that's kind of how you get past, right? If you are a Babylonian priest, if you're a Babylonian elite, you're not stupid, obviously, right? You know that these images of the gods that you make, it's very easy to level kind of this objection that we see or that we saw in Psalms and Jeremiah, right? That kind of, these are things that are made by humans. They're made by, they're made of wood. Why would you pray to them, right? They can't actually do anything. How do you get past that? You get past that through ritual, through belief, through different practice that turns it from a statue made by human hands into an image of the divine made by divine craftsmen, right? Through these different ceremonies. Good. All right. The reason why, obviously, I included kind of this source here, I think it really shows an interesting view into these texts, into Jeremiah, Psalms. There's a couple of other texts actually that kind of do a similar thing that, right, these idols cannot hear, they can't speak, they can't smell, they can't see. These ideas that, sure, right, these could just be kind of insults hurled at these cultures, but they could also betray at least some sort of idea, some sort of potential familiarity, if not with the mouth opening ritual, with the different problems that it's supposed to solve, right? That the peoples, the Babylonians and Assyrians, who use this mouth opening ritual to turn their cult objects into kind of divine manifestations from things that can't smell or see or hear or eat, right? According to the text itself, they know they can't do any of these things without the ritual. The ritual transforms it, right? Jeremiah and Psalms are kind of reappropriating the words of the ritual to kind of say, right, you said it yourselves, that these are things that, right, these are idols of silver of gold, work of men's hands, who in the text itself, those men's hands are then cut off, right? But here they're the work of men's hands. Even if you ritually cut off the craftsman's hands, it's not, you know, you're not changing how these things were made. They can't speak, right? They have mouths, but they cannot speak, eyes, but they cannot see. Someone, Nathaniel Levtow is his name. He put forth this idea that these texts, right, specifically from Jeremiah, who's writing during the time of the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem, Psalm 115, which very well, right from just what the psalm is saying, seems like it's at least written at a time when kind of dealing with other nations and other peoples and their gods was a big problem, right? And kind of how do we counteract that? It's bringing in these ideas that we see in the mouth opening ritual and kind of, right, turning them on their head a little bit, as any good commentator does. Any questions for us here for these sources?
So does the person who makes them do it once, or can they continue working?
Yeah, it's a great question. We don't have, unfortunately, we don't have good evidence for like named individuals who were these master craftsmen who worked on these divine statues. That being said, you almost certainly had a master craftsman at a temple who was in charge of not only making new divine images, right, on those rare occasions when kind of they were stolen and you needed to make a new one or something like that. But these things were obviously very well cared for, but because their core is made of wood, they degrade after a certain time. And so you have to make kind of, you have to repair them, you have to give them new clothes, you have to do all these things. And when you do any of that, after you repair them, after you do any of that, you also have to kind of go through this mouth opening or mouth washing ritual.
So that means you do it once.
You'll probably, so you probably could do it more than once, but it's not like this is your only job, right? It's not like every day you're just repairing divine statues or something like that. That being said, you also probably didn't talk about it much because there's almost certainly, right, this ambiguity and fear, if you will, right? Potential fear of the divine, that you're not kind of going out and saying, yeah, I'm the one who repaired all these statues, you know? Probably. Okay. So we have a few minutes left. With those few minutes, let's jump to some of the Talmudic sources, because I think those are fun to kind of see, right? We looked at sources within the Tanakh itself, how much exposure between Judah and Israel on the one hand and Babylonia and Assyria on the other before the conquests of Israel and Judah, right? That's kind of up for debate. After the conquest of Israel and Judah and the deportation, obviously these are individuals who are living in Babylonia and Assyria themselves. The Babylonian Talmud obviously is evidence of a Jewish community living in Babylonia for, at this point, by the time the Babylonian Talmud is written down, right, between 200 and 600, they're living in Babylonia for around 1,000 years, right? So they are kind of well entrenched in that community. Good. Okay, so we're going to skip over these. We're going to go straight to Rosh Hashanah, page 21a. Who wants to read this source for us?
I will.
Great.
It was related that Rav Nachman said to those setting out to sea before Nisan, since you will not know the determination of the first day of the new month, this is what you should do. When you see that the moon completes the day, that is visible all night from sundown to sunrise, know that it is the middle of the month of Nisan and burn your leaven. The Gemara asks, when does the moon set at daybreak? On the 15th of the month, but on the 14th of Nisan, we burn leaven. The Gemara answers, for those out at sea to whom the world is revealed, to whom the horizon is wide open and clearly visible, the moon completes its course at sunrise already on the 14th of the month. They can therefore rely on this sign to establish the date of Passover and the time for burning leaven.
Thanks, Mom. All right. Who can kind of give a quick summary of what are the questions, right? When you're reading a Talmudic source, obviously, all of these kind of terse phrases that we're fleshing out with kind of the non-bold text, right? Everything in bold is a translation of what we see in the Talmud. Everything not in bold is what we have to add in to make this make sense, right? But so what are the questions that we're answering here?
Well, how do you know what the first day is? The
Good,
first
right?
day
So
of the new month?
absolutely. How do you know the first day of the new month? Specifically, if you are a sailor and therefore you weren't around for the when the new month was announced by the Sanhedrin, right? And so if you're not there when the new month is announced by the Sanhedrin, you can guess, right? You can have a good idea because you're looking at the moon, but you can't know for certain. And so how do you know that? How do you deal with that? Good. What else?
Right, burning 11.
How do you determine the beginning of the month? But more importantly, why do we care about determining the beginning of the month, right? Rosh Hashanah cares about determining the beginning of the month from a standard perspective that, yes, it's an important thing to do, but it really cares about two specific circumstances a lot.
It cares about when you have to burn the leaven.
Good. For which holiday?
Passover.
Good, right? So it cares about Pesach, it cares about Rosh Chodesh, Nisan a lot, right? And kind of when you determine that and things like that with Pesach, but it really cares a lot about, right, Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, and specifically even a month before Rosh Chodesh Elul, and how to kind of deal with those months, right? That's what most of the Gemara is talking about. But here we're talking about Nisan, right? We're talking about Rosh Chodesh Nisan because it's important. 14 days in, we need to be burning our chametz, okay? If we look at the Aramaic here, right, right? They didn't know about when the month itself was set, right? Ki chazito sihara demashlim. Okay. That being said, when you see that the moon demashlim deyoma or demashlim leyoma, okay, has completed the day. Okay, so that's the phrase that we are translating here. When you see that the moon completes the day, and then basically the translation is the full moon. Okay, when the moon is visible all night long. The reason why that needs an explanation is because this phrase demashlim leyoma is not the normal way that you would kind of say a new moon, okay? It's kind of it's an odd phrase, and so we have to explain it here in our English translation, right, as kind of a completing the day. Specifically, that completing the day leads us to the 14th of the month, even though normally we know that the new moon is on the 15th of the month, okay? That's kind of what's going on here in this Talmudic passage. Who wants to read this celestial report to the Assyrian king, dated from anywhere between 680 and 631.
Okay, I will. The moon will complete the day in Tammuz on the 14th day. It will be seen with the sun. It, meaning the moon, will make the eclipse pass by. It, meaning the eclipse, will not occur from Nabu Ahe Kriba.
Good. Okay, so what are these things? These celestial reports, we have somewhere around, I would say, 550 of these reports. These are written on clay tablets, and these are sent by the most important scholars of the time period in modern day Iraq to the king of Assyria, who was kind of the king of the world at this time, right? This is when Assyria controls not only, right, Israel is no longer, it's already been conquered, it controls Judah, it controls all the way down to Egypt, right, controls all the way to Iran. So this is kind of the most important person at the time. I think it's pretty easy to say that in terms of, right, territorial power, all those kinds of things. And so these are the scholars who help him run the empire. And how do they help him run the empire? They help him run the empire by keeping watch for different things that happen in the night sky, specifically new moons, full moons, things like that. So really kind of typical calendrical stuff. How do you determine a new month? Okay, but also really importantly, so this source from Jeremiah that we read before, thus said the Lord, do not learn to go away the way of the nations, do not be dismayed by portents in the sky, right? Meotota shamayim. These portents in the sky, this is exactly what we're talking about here, right? Do not be dismayed by the portents in the sky. This is basically saying, do not, right, set up this system like the Assyrian king had set up, right, back in his day, because by the time Jeremiah is writing this, the Assyrian king is already done for, right? But back in his day, the Assyrian king had this huge system set up to not only fix the calendar, but to make sure that anything that happened in the sky was seen by his scholars and was noted and, right, all was explained. And so that they could, right, everyone could be prepared for what they thought the evil that was going to happen or the disaster that was going to happen because of these portents in the sky, right? So here, right, the first part of this report, this kind of 3-line report, is connected to calendrical stuff, right? The second part, the moon will make the eclipse pass by, the eclipse will not occur, all right? So that's basically saying, look, this moon, this eclipse that we said maybe could occur in this month, right? Maybe in the month of Av, right? That's not actually going to happen. And so we don't even have to kind of keep watch for the eclipse, right? It's not going to happen. There's not going to be any bad sign connected to it, okay? Because eclipses were kind of seen as a very bad thing in certain cases. Great. The first part, though, is what we care about here. The moon will complete the day in Tammuz, okay? So that phrase, complete the day, is basically the Akkadian cognate of mashlim liyoma, okay? Also, right, using a version of the verb shin lamed mem, right, to complete, and then the day, right, in Akkadian here. So in Akkadian, to complete the day, at least at this time, was connected to the beginning of the month, okay? The moon will complete the day in Tammuz means that Tammuz is going to have 30 days, which is good because you can have a lunar month that has either 29 days or 30 days. That is 29 days, even in the modern Hebrew calendar, right? It's defective, right? That's not a full or normal month. The full or normal month is the 30-day month, okay? Even though we understand that we alternate between 29 and 30-day months. So this is telling us the moon is going to complete the day in Tammuz, meaning that Tammuz is going to have 30 days. And so Av is going to have what we would consider a 2-day Rosh Chodesh, right? It's going to start on the 1st, as opposed to if Tammuz was a deficient month and it only had 29 days, then the 1st of the month could be the 30th of Tammuz, right? So whatever, so all these calendrical things. What's interesting for our purposes here is that completing the day, even though it refers to the beginning of the month, in our source from the Talmud, it doesn't refer to the beginning of the month, right? It seems like it's connecting the beginning of the month and not necessarily knowing when the beginning of the month was to a full moon on the 14th of the month, right? Because you see the moon, this full moon on the 14th of the month, and that's how you know that that's the night that you're supposed to do Bior Chametz, and that's when Pesach is going to start, okay? The reason why that's interesting is because in the Akkadian sources that we have, like I said, even though completing the day refers to the beginning of the month, it almost always is connected to, if it is connected to a prediction about the full moon is going to happen on the 14th day of the month. It's not going to happen on the 15th. It's not going to happen on the 16th or the 13th, right? The prediction after the moon completes the day, the month before, that next month, the full moon is going to be on the 14th day. All right, and so what I would posit here, and other people have done it before me, specifically Jonathan Ben Dov, is that Rav Nachman is using this phrase to complete the month, right? This is a phrase that had a long history in Akkadian. At this point, it's already moved, right? Its meaning has slipped a little. Instead of meaning something about kind of when to declare the new moon, it instead is used by Rav Nachman with reference to the full moon. Okay, so the meaning has slipped, and that's what Jonathan Ben Dov says. I would actually say something a little more. yes, the meaning has slipped, but that being said, this idea of the moon completing the month, or sorry, the moon completing the day, actually retains this idea that it had in the Akkadian sources, that it was also connected to a full moon on the 14th day of the month, right? Because here we see that the Talmud is a little ambivalent, or there's a question about, but isn't the full moon normally on the 15th, right? How would we know that it's supposed to be on the 14th? And they say, right, they kind of jump through these hoops and saying that, well, if you're on the sea and you have the whole horizon before you, then you're going to see that the full moon's on the 14th. I would say that the reason, right, that Rav Nachman kind of introduced this phrase in the first place, because already this idea of the moon completing the day was connected still with this idea of a full moon on the 14th day, even when Rav Nachman had said this some, I don't know, 800, 900 years after Nabu Ache Eriba had sent his note to the Assyrian king. Okay, so that's just a little bit here. We have a number of other sources. We have a fun source from Sanhedrin in terms of witchcraft and things like that. Feel free to look at these in your own time. But I hope that what this class specifically, and then what the two classes even before this have really shown, is that, right, by looking at the comparative material, by looking at the Tanakh, by looking at the the Torah in its context, we just get a much deeper understanding of what's going on. We often get many more questions, right? We often kind of, find ourselves scratching our heads and saying, well, who knew what at which time? And that's good, right? Because Judaism as a religion of questioning, right? That's what it's all about. And so I would really kind of push for using as much of these kind of cognate comparative sources as possible to flesh out what the world was like, without going overboard and saying, look, everything is right? Nothing in the Tanakh or nothing in the Torah is new. Everything is taken from these other peoples, this and that, right? I think it's pretty clear if we're looking at the sources. Yeah, maybe there are some similarities. Maybe there's some ideas that we can see maybe traveled from one to the other, but it's very often not a cut and dry case of, oh, this culture adopted something from the other culture, right? It's very often messy. It's very often a process that takes time and understanding to appreciate how it happened. And I hope that these three courses have given us a little bit more of that appreciation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Zach,
Wonderful.
it's too bad you're only doing 3 classes.
More.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So when do you go on to ancient Greece or ancient Rome? And
listen, I'm happy to go out of my comfort zone and kind of do some of the things that I've noted there. Because of my current job, the next time I could teach would have to be some point in the future, but I would love to do it again. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And thanks very much again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Pleasure.
you.
Okay.
Everyone.
More.
Okay, Zach.
Sure,
Say we'll have to get you for next year then.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Ron.
Okay. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you.
Right.
Okay. How do I even end this here?